Good afternoon. My name is Mark Alliegro. I'm a candidate for Congress in the Massachusetts 9th Congressional District. And the reason I bring that up is because as I travel around the 9th District, a lot of people ask me, what's my stance on gun control? What do I know and understand about the Second Amendment? And so we thought this would be a good vehicle for me to make that statement and explain a little bit about the law. So I want to start off first with an important concept. Now, first of all, I want to tell you I'm not an attorney. I'm a scientist, so law is not my bailiwick. However, the U.S. Constitution was written so that the average person of the day could read it. In fact, in contrast to our 2,000-plus page laws that get passed through the House and signed by the President these days, if you took the U.S. Constitution and typed it out double-spaced on standard typing paper and stacked it, it would be about the thickness of one thin dime. It would be about 16 double-spaced typed pages altogether. And that's the law that governs our land. Simple, clear, made easy for a person to understand, and ingenious at the same time. So let me tell you about a concept that we're probably all familiar with and we don't fully understand unless this is your area of expertise, and that's the spirit of the law. I want to start with that, and I'm going to read from my notes from time to time during this presentation. The spirit of the law refers to ideas that the creators of a particular law wanted to have in effect. It's the intent and the purpose of the lawmaker or lawmakers as determined by a consideration of the whole context of the law. The spirit of the law is determined from the letters and the circumstances surrounding the law's enactment. Now, with that brief introduction, let me begin with the next slide, please. If I were to give this talk a title, I would call it Understanding the Second Amendment by its historical roots and by the framers' intent. And I want to point out that this talk is excerpted from a lecture that I gave to a really fine group that meets on Cape Cod in Centerville once a month. It's called We the People of Cape Cod, Inc., and I would urge you to go to their website and learn about this. It's a constitutional study group. It's excellent lectures are presented, sometimes with outside speakers. It's WTPOCC.org, We the People of Cape Cod.org. So this is an abbreviated version of that lecture. Now, the Second Amendment was adopted in December of 1791 as part of the first 10 amendments contained in the Bill of Rights. And you might be interested to know that there are actually two versions of the Second Amendment. And there are minor differences between them, but they managed to create a whole heck of a lot of hullabaloo. The first version, which states, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, this is the version that was ratified by the states and authenticated by Thomas Jefferson, who was then the Secretary of State. Now, there's another version, and this one has a couple of minor differences to it, really not in the wording, just in the punctuation. There are two commas that have been added, and you can see them in red right after a well-regulated militia and after the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma. This is the version that was passed by the Congress and preserved in the National Archives with the rest of the original handwritten copy of the full Bill of Rights prepared by scribe William Lambert. Now, those couple of commas really don't make any substantive difference, but they cause people to pause in their reading of the Second Amendment, and so they highlight the phraseology a little bit. They highlight what we can refer to as the subordinate clause in this. So let's go to the next slide. Right. What it all boils down to is the meaning of the word militia, or a well-regulated militia for that matter, and the meaning, and importantly, the purpose in the term bearing arms. And those are what we're going to discuss today and examine their historical roots and put them in context and understand them through the framers' eyes as they were written. In other words, we're going to examine the spirit of the law, the spirit of the Second Amendment. So the next slide. And what better way to do it than to go right to the person, George Mason, who's considered the father of the Bill of Rights, including the Second Amendment. Now, George Mason was a Virginian. He was very active in the politics of his time. He was the author of the Virginia State Constitution, and actually an earlier document than that, but he was the primary author of the Virginia State Constitution, from which the U.S. Constitution borrowed quite a bit. And Mr. Mason says this, "I ask, sir, what is the militia? It is the whole people, except for a few public officials." So today, we like to think of the militia as, when we talk about regulated, we're thinking of, and if you go to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, you'll see that one or two of the definitions, there are several, actually indicate that it's a government agency, that it's an arm of the government, the militia. That's not the case by definition, and it certainly was not the case then. As a matter of fact, the militia stood apart from the government. Again, George Mason's quote, "I ask, sir, what is the militia? It's the whole people, except for a few public officials." Let's look at the next slide. So now, with that understanding, we're going to add more to it. We're going to look at the historical roots of the Constitution itself and the Second Amendment within that context. We're going to do it by looking at its history, where it came from, and we'll do it by looking at what the framers of our Constitution had in mind in their personal and in their public writings at the time. So, even before the Virginia Constitution, the U.S. Constitution is rooted in the English Bill of Rights, which was enacted in 1689. Now, you'll notice on this slide that there are several elements, and this is just a few elements of the English Bill of Rights, but I've just pulled them out for examples. There are several elements here that have direct bearing on our own U.S. Constitution and the Virginia Constitution as well in between. The first is that laws should not be dispensed with or suspended without the consent of Parliament. Now, you might recognize that as Article 1, Section 1 of our own Constitution, which empowers the Congress to create laws or to withdraw or repeal laws, in other words. So the power of lawmaking lies with our Congress. That comes from the English Bill of Rights. Number two, no taxes should be levied without the authority of Parliament. Again, that comes from our own, or I should say that's a direct predecessor to our own U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, which empowers Congress to levy and collect taxes. No other branch of government is allowed to do that. No other government agency is allowed to do that without the express empowerment of the U.S. Congress, the House and the Senate. Next is the right to petition the monarch should be without fear of retribution. That's the predecessor of our own First Amendment, the right to free speech, the ability to say what you want, when you want, and to whom you want to say it, without fear of punishment. Finally, and this is the one that's most pertinent to our discussion today, is Protestant subjects may have arms for their defense as suitable to their class and as allowed by law. That's the predecessor in the English Constitution to our own Second Amendment. Now, next slide will tell us a little bit about the history of that, and I'll give you a little bit of background. So it specifically mentions Protestants, and the reason is because this part of the English Bill of Rights was drafted and enacted because of the circumstances in England at the time. King James was the ruler. James was a Catholic, and he had a penchant for suppressing and undermining Protestants. One of the things that he did to keep them from protecting themselves and defending themselves was to make it illegal for Protestants to have arms. But Papists were allowed to carry arms. And so here's a little bit from the English Bill of Rights. Let's get the old cheaters on. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I've got some of it highlighted in red, as you can see. Whereas the late King James II, by the assistance of diverse evil counselors, so on and so forth, by causing several good subjects, being Protestants, to be disarmed. King James wanted to suppress them, and so the first thing that he did was to disarm them. Make common sense. And then the article carries on, and at the bottom, also in red, it says that the subjects which are Protestants may have arms for their defense suitable to their conditions and allowed by law. In other words, the English Bill of Rights was providing that the Protestants should be able to arm themselves, to keep and bear arms, to defend their liberties and rights against a tyrannical government. Sound familiar? All right. Let's talk a little bit about an evaluation of those principles. And this is from the Commentaries on the Laws of England by Sir William Blackstone. Sir William Blackstone is considered one of the premier interpreters and evaluators, historians of English law, long regarded as the leading work. His articles, the Commentaries on the Laws of England, was long regarded as the leading work on the development of English law. Here's a few other facts. It was the first methodical treatise on the common law suitable for lay readership since at least the Middle Ages. And the commentaries are often quoted as the definitive pre-revolutionary source of common law by United States courts. And in fact, they're frequently quoted in U.S. Supreme Court decisions. So the next slide has a quote from Sir William Blackstone, and I'll read. In these several articles consist the rights, or as they are frequently termed, the liberties of Englishmen. I'm going to skip over quite a bit of text and to a later phrase or a few sentences in this page. And lastly, to vindicate these rights, now he's going to tell what people can do to redress their grievances, right? And lastly, to vindicate these rights, when actually violated or attacked, the subjects of England are entitled, in the first place, to the regular administration and free course of justice in the courts of law. In the second place, next, to the right of petitioning the King and Parliament for redress of grievances. Again, that's without fear of retribution. And here's the zinger. Finally, and lastly, to the right of having and using arms for self-preservation and defense. There's the English Constitution, and there's Sir William Blackstone's evaluation of what it means. So let's summarize this first little part of the presentation by saying that, and again, I want to keep repeating this term, the spirit of the law. And we're going to talk more about the spirit of the law as we go on. But here's a summary. The author of the Virginia State Constitution and the father of the Bill of Rights, that would be Mason, states that the militia consists of all the people. The English Bill of Rights, from which the Virginia and the Virginia State Constitution and the U.S. Constitution are sequentially derived, states that subjects or citizens have the liberty, the right, to keep and bear arms for purposes of self-defense. Let's look at the next slide. Okay, so let's continue on. As you recall, early on in the first slide, I said that the spirit of law is determined in part by writings, statements, personal and private, by the makers of the law, the people who drafted the law. What was their intent when they created the law? So if what I said already isn't enough, here's some glimpses into the framers' intent in their own words. And the next slide, we'll have several quotes from James Madison. They'll pop up on the screen one at a time. Now, James Madison is considered the father of the Constitution. He's the first author of the Bill of Rights, including the Second Amendment. So if you're looking for someone who drafted, wrote, created a law, in this particular case, you can find no one closer to the situation than James Madison himself. And James Madison says, a government that does not trust its law-abiding citizens to keep and bear arms is itself unworthy of trust. Another quote from James Madison, a people armed and free forms a barrier against the enterprises of ambition and is a bulwark for the nation against foreign invasion and domestic oppression. And a third quote from James Madison. Americans, and this is very interesting because this is pertinent today, often we hear comparisons between ourselves and countries around the world, particularly Europe, and we'll make a point about some of the statistics often bandied about there in a moment. But it says, Americans never need fear their government because of the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation. Now, today, modern statistics uphold that not only do we possess that advantage, but you often hear people wrongfully state that the United States has the highest incidence of gun crime, gun violence in the world. It's not true. The United Nations and various United Nations commissions have performed studies, and in these studies of somewhere in the neighborhood of 160, 170 countries around the world, it shows, as we all know, that the United States of America has the highest per capita gun ownership of any in the world. But where we fall in terms of violent crime and gun violence is below the 100 mark. In fact, I think it's about 109th out of approximately 160 countries in the survey. There's no correlation between per capita gun ownership and violent or gun crime. Indeed, if you want to squeeze out any kind of a correlative relationship between the two, you'll find that there's a slight downward slope. So there's a hint that higher per capita gun ownership actually makes it a safer environment. Anyway, there are the comments of James Madison. We can see his intent, the primary writer of the Second Amendment. Here's George Mason again. Again, the father of the Bill of Rights, the author of the Virginia State Constitution, that predecessor of our own U.S. Constitution, and including the Second Amendment. Father of the Bill of Rights, including the Second Amendment, on this next slide says, "To disarm the people is the best and most effectual way to enslave them." And if you have any doubts about that, take a look at Europe and the Middle East in our modern day. In the next slide, we have a quote by our fifth President of the United States, James Monroe, also one of the framers of the Constitution and founders of our country. James Monroe says, "Of the liberty of conscience in matters of religious faith, of speech and of the press, of the trial by jury, of the vicinage in civil and criminal cases, of the benefit of the writ and of habeas corpus, of the right to keep and bear arms, if these rights are well defined and secured against encroachment, it is impossible that government should ever degenerate into tyranny." I highlight of the right to keep and bear arms in red for you all to see in that. Let's look at the next slide. This is from George Washington. Now, to be fair, there are some who challenge the authenticity of this statement. I've seen no challenges to the sources or authenticity of the other statements from our framers. This one is often challenged, but it's worth reviewing anyway. Cheaters on. George Washington, the man who signed the Second Amendment into law in 1791, says, "Firearms stand next in importance to the Constitution itself. They are the American people's liberty teeth and keystone under independence. The church, the plow, the prairie wagon, and citizens' firearms are indelibly related. From the hour of the Pilgrim's Landing to the present day, events, occurrences, and tendencies prove that to ensure peace, security, and happiness, the rifle and the pistol are equally indispensable. Every corner of this land knows firearms. It's true today. And more than 99 and 99/100% of them, by their silence, indicate they are in safe and sane hands. The very atmosphere of firearms, anywhere and everywhere, restrains evil interference. They deserve a place with all that's good. When firearms go, all goes. We need them every hour." It sounds almost like he's referring to gun-free zones of our modern day, which, by the way, are the sites of virtually every single mass attack using firearms in this country, gun-free zones. Here are some final thoughts from James Madison on the deterrent effect of the Second Amendment. Now, in the course of discussion, it's often questioned, what are we going to do? I mean, can civilians have tanks? Can they have, submachine guns? Can they have hand grenades and bazookas? If the object of the Second Amendment is to defend against tyranny by government, and let me stop right there because the purpose of the Second Amendment is more broad than that. That's at the core of it. But all the arguments that we used to hear about why we need a Second Amendment, because someone might want to collect guns, historical artifacts that happen to be firearms, because someone likes the sport of target shooting, or likes to hunt, or wants to defend their home against invasion and protect their family. Those are all important elements for the Second Amendment as well. The protection against tyrannical government is probably the key motivator, but just one of them. But here are some final thoughts from James Madison on the deterrent effect of the Second Amendment. Because no, the average American is not going to own a tank or a bazooka or a submachine gun. No, we cannot actually match a military invasion or an internal government militia action with our own arms. Not bullet for bullet, not firepower for firepower. But here's what James Madison says, and it's only common sense. The highest number, it's amazing that these people were thinking about these things hundreds of years ago, and we're still talking about them today. The highest number to which a standing army can be carried in any country does not exceed 1/100th part of the souls, or 1/25th part of the number able to bear arms. This portion would not yield in the United States, at that time, an army of more than 25 or 30,000 men. To these would be opposed a militia, right? That's all the people, as Mason said. To these would be opposed a militia amounting to near 500,000 citizens with arms in their hands, officered by men and chosen from among themselves, fighting for their common liberties, and united and conducted by governments possessing their affections and confidence. It may well be doubted whether a militia thus circumstanced could ever be conquered by such a proportion of regular troops. The idea here is that we do not have to match a tyrannical government or an invading government arm for arm. We just have to serve as a deterrent, and that's what a civilian militia would do. That's what the framers of our Constitution understood. He goes on, the governments of Europe are afraid to trust the people with arms. Let us not insult the free and gallant citizens of America with the suspicion that they would be less able to defend the rights of which they would be in actual possession than the debased subjects of arbitrary power would be to rescue theirs from the hands of their oppressors. In other words, a civilian militia, at least modestly armed, would serve as more of a deterrent to a tyrannical outside force or a tyrannical internal force to retain the rights we already possess than would it be possible for a system of people, or I should say a citizenry that is unarmed, to become armed and reclaim the rights that were stolen from them. So, just a little update, and these are not very new cases, but it just summarizes where we stand with the Second Amendment today. Here's two key cases in this next slide. The District of Columbia versus Heller. Now, this was a landmark decision handed down. It involved Richard Heller, who was a former law enforcement agent in the District of Columbia, and watched his neighborhood deteriorate. I believe in this particular case, there were several robberies involved. In any case, his neighborhood was going to pot, and maybe quite literally. And he decided that he wanted to purchase a firearm, a handgun, so that he can keep it in his apartment and protect himself. The District of Columbia already bans walking about with a handgun. But Mr. Heller was denied a permit to purchase a handgun. He took it to court. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that he has the right to purchase a handgun, possess it in his apartment, keep it in a loaded condition, because he would have had to keep it unloaded and locked, which does you no good if you have a home invasion. But the important thing about this particular Supreme Court case was that the District of Columbia, as you know, is a federal jurisdiction. So the meaning of the case, or the weight of the case, the weight of the decision was restricted to federal jurisdictions. However, just a couple of years later in Chicago, we have McDonald, that's Otis McDonald, versus the city of Chicago. And in this case, the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment extends those rights that we possess in a federal jurisdiction like Washington, D.C., to all of the 50 states and municipalities. So, in other words, the Supreme Court now has ruled firmly and unequivocally that citizens have the right to keep and bear arms, at the very least, in their own domicile. In the next slide, we're just going to summarize the presentation. This is the bottom line. The right of the people to keep and bear arms is these days finally expanding nationwide, notwithstanding the action that our own Attorney General just took in the past week and a half to ban essentially all rifles that are painted black and look, cool. The right of the people to keep and bear arms is expanding nationwide. the Attorney General in this state has, if not already been challenged, I believe she's already been challenged in court, and this case will probably go all the way to the Supreme Court as well. And Attorney General Healy will find her actions to be ruled illegal and unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. That's my prediction. The pressure will now be on the states to comply with the federal law. In the cases of Washington, D.C. and in Chicago, the municipalities are scrambling to craft laws that can circumvent and just squeeze between the cracks of the decisions that were put down by the Supreme Court. But ultimately, they're challenged, and it'll be opened up again so that the Constitution will be adhered to. Now, finally, the reason for the Second Amendment advocacy is finally out in the open, right? This crops up cyclically, and there's always a low level of pressure for people who want to countermand the Second Amendment on our Constitution. There's always a certain amount of pressure to put more and more restrictions on our gun ownership rights. I remember back in the 1990s and the early 2000s, when this would be argued, people would say, well, Sally likes to collect guns, and John likes to hunt, and Frank, he's a target shooter, and so they should have the right to do those things. And we, who stood on the side of the Constitution, often ceded the field of discussion to the opposition. The reality is that the Second Amendment is to ensure, in the words of Thomas Jefferson, that people retain their right to keep and bear arms as a last resort to protect themselves against tyranny in government. Ladies and gentlemen, those aren't my words, those are Thomas Jefferson's. Those are the words and the conclusions and the intent of the framers of our Constitution, the founders of our country, and that's the meaning of the Second Amendment. Thank you very much.